Just let a bunch of people in.
Okay. Just got to make sure we got. Yes. And the YouTube is muted. And this is gone and this is gone. Okay. Okay. The clock way over in the corner says 11 a.m., which means it's time for community church. Welcome, everybody. I'm going to start with a song. It's written by my buddy Jay Mankita from Amherst. It's called Pledge Allegiance to the Earth. As I have come to know this world from the moment of my birth until the day my life is done, I'll pledge allegiance to the earth. I'll pledge allegiance to the earth. From this world we have grown, planet, body, Gaia, home. Learning to make peace with ourselves, realize we're not alone. As I have come to know this world from the moment of my birth until the day my life is done, I'll pledge allegiance to the earth. I'll pledge allegiance to the earth. We are all made of dust, and we'll all return someday. All of our weapons and our power, not so hard to wash away. As I have come to know this world from the moment of my birth till the day my life is done, I'll pledge allegiance to the earth. I'll pledge allegiance to the earth. As we live, so live all. Flags and countries rise and fall. In the rhythm of this planet, I can hear my own heart call. As I have come to know this world from the moment of my birth until the day my life is done, I'll pledge allegiance to the earth. 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 Good morning. My name is Dean Stevens. I'm called the interim minister, what did I say? Interim administrator of Community Church of Boston, but mostly I'm just the guitar player. And I light this candle to welcome you and to start this wonderful program that I've been looking forward to for a long time. And I can hardly wait to tell you more about it. But first I'm going to blow the candle out so I don't burn the place down or set off the fire alarm. And just tell you a little bit about us. There's a good number of people here that maybe we haven't seen before. We call ourselves a Peace and Justice Congregation since 1920, which means that we are 102 years old. And we have this really amazing history. We were the biggest church in Boston for about 40 or 50 years. We met in enormous halls like Symphony Hall or Conservatory Auditorium or Morse Auditorium, Jordan Hall, where a lot of people would come to hear very well-known orators of the day and would be inspired by this really different approach to and definition of, if such a thing could be, of what church and religion is supposed to be. Here we are 102 years later, after it was started just in the aftermath of World War I, and we're still at it. And we are housed in this old funky 5-story storefront building in Copley Square. We acknowledge that this is land reclaimed from the ocean where the fishies used to swim underneath, and there are still fish weirs that archaeological digs have found in places like the Boston Common in the public garden. And that means that along the banks of this place, the Wampanoag and the Nipmuc and the Pawtucket used to fish and live, and we recognize that this is land where they were for thousands of years. So welcome, and I want to just start with a few little things. We've had just some great stuff happen lately. The first thing I'll tell you about, I wish I had my phone to show you around, but we've been inundated with books. The estate of the late Robert Datilio has given us books that would have gone into the dumpster, and we said, we've got to take them. Little did we know that there were enough books in that two-family house to fill this auditorium, which is 2,000 square feet, and then some. There's a third floor that has a bunch of unopened boxes of books, and it's a wonderful feast of the history of the 20th century. Literary history, art history, architecture, photography, dance. His wife was in the Boston Ballet. She was a dance instructor at Boston Conservatory. It's just endless. And, you know, there's only one drawback, which is it takes up a lot of space, and we're going to have to make some decisions if this is ever going to be an auditorium where we can meet and receive people again, which we are not doing too much now. We have a few people that come physically and join us, but it's mostly a virtual program right now. You're welcome to come. Please come and see this feast of books, this plenitudinous plethora of books of every kind. It just is incredible. And there is also an enormous treasure trove of materials on the case that is commemorated behind us, that's called the Sacco and Vanzetti plaque there behind us. The Sacco and Vanzetti, who were charged with committing a crime, two Italian immigrants in 1920, right at the birth of the church. And the church, it was one of their first causes was defense of Sacco and Vanzetti. Of course, in 1927 they were executed, and they remain sort of our, what would you call it, martyr patron saints. And we give out an annual Sacco and Vanzetti Award that has recently gone to the likes of Daniel Ellsberg. This year was Julian Assange. In recent years has been Medea Benjamin, Mumia Abu Jamal. The first one ever was named William Kunstler, the famous defense attorney, and it's Cesar Chavez. Lots of others have won that award. I want to tell you a little bit about things that are coming up. Of course, we're doing the Friday concerts, and we invite you to join us for those shows. It's a free concert, unless you want to buy a ticket, and we have the mechanism for you to do that on Eventbrite ticket page or function event page. And those, all these details are on our Facebook page or our website. You can also get a paper version if you want to leave your address in the chat. And this talks about some upcoming events. This past Friday was Eric Kilburn's wonderful songwriter. Next Friday is Jacqueline Schwab. Jacqueline is a brilliant pianist of great elegance, grace, and style. Jacqueline is best known for her work with Ken Burns, the great documentary filmmaker on PBS. Her piano playing graces the Civil War series, the World War II series, the baseball. It goes on and on, and this is just a major, amazing talent, and that's this coming Friday. There are other performers as well coming up. Danielle Miralia is a young diva of the blues in Boston. John and Rachel Nicholas join us from Camden, Maine. They're a folk rock duo who sing in beautiful harmonies. Jeff Kaufman is a sea shanty man, the head shanty man at the Mystic Seaport in Connecticut. On and on. It's a feast. Join us on Fridays, and then there's Sundays. Next Sunday, we have a really interesting one. This church has a strong Maine connection. That is the state of Maine, not including today's speaker, Mark, who is originally from Maine, but also a couple of members who join us from north of Bangor and also from Brunswick. And next Sunday's speakers are both Maine. Originally from Maine. Bruce Gagnon still lives in Maine and is a serious peace activist, is found at the Bath Iron Works many times protesting military madness. And then there's Regis Tremblay, lived many years in Maine. Now he lives in Odessa, Ukraine, or Russia, whatever it is. Regis will join us with his strong opinions about the growing conflict in Russia, Ukraine, and it'll be very interesting to hear his opinions. Regis is a filmmaker and a speaker. It'll be an amazing program. I want to tell you also about something that we just scheduled. It's February 14th, Valentine's Day. That's on a Monday. And this is a live international webinar conversation between Layla Farsak, Palestinian-born in Jordan, political economist and chair of the political science department at University of Massachusetts, Boston. And she will be in conversation with Jeff Halper, who lives in Jerusalem and is a Jewish Israeli, co-founder of the Israeli Committee Against Home Demolitions. Again, amazing conversation there. We have a list of incredible co-sponsors, the Friends Society, the Quakers in Cambridge, as well as Jewish Voice for Peace, and UUs for Justice in the Middle East, and Muslims for Progressive Values, a group that meets in our auditorium. quite a wonderful list of co-sponsors for that program, which is on Monday, February 14th. So lots of great stuff coming up. This program is a very personal one, just because it is the fruit of an incredible once-in-a-lifetime journey that Jennifer and I took this past September to Idaho to take a raft trip down the Salmon River, and I'll never forget it. It's just a incredible, beyond awesome, life-changing, life-forming experience. And it's also very personal because I get to sing the songs today. We have different musicians every single Sunday, and I can list you those as well, but it's just a feast of different stuff. We believe in hearing all kinds of voices here. And I did something this past Friday, which I want to do again, which is take you for a little tour around my makeshift man cave office here. It's quite a mess, and it's right in the middle of the auditorium. And first thing is about a program that's coming up. This artist is named Anna Brones. Anna Brones does woodcuts with quotes from women. This one is Winona LaDuke, who spoke at Community Church about 5-6 weeks ago, right at the beginning of our season. And this quote is, "Power is not brute force and money. Power is in your spirit. Power is in your soul. It is what your ancestors, your old people gave you. Power is in the earth. It is in your relationship to the earth." Winona LaDuke. I saw this and I had to contact this artist immediately, Anna Brones, and look her up. It's spelled Brones. And fruit of that email exchange, Anna Brones is joining us in April to give a talk on art and social change. And you look up her website, and it's just a remarkable bunch of woodcuts like that. Next, I take you to another thing on my desk, which is this little. I've been looking for this for the longest time. Donald Lothrop was our minister for 39 years, from the 30s all the way into the late 70s. And in the 50s, the community church was pegged by a local committee in the State House Boston. Is a committee that was called the Committee to Investigate Un-American Activities, and they were in place with a huge budget for about 3 or 4 years. And when Lothrop was asked to testify, he gave this fiery speech that is just a remarkable piece of oratory. And it was in response to Community Church of Boston having been pegged as under direction from the Communist Party by a certain senator who's named Bowker, who was the chair of this special commission to study and investigate communism and subversive activities and related matters in the Commonwealth, Philip G. Bowker. This fiery speech ended the committee. It was disbanded about a month later. And I just found this speech, and I'm going to have it digitized and put up on our website and get it around. It's just a remarkable document in our mid-history. And finally, I'm going to do a little reading, which I've been reading a lot of every Sunday, almost every Sunday. Eduardo Galeano from Uruguay. He passed away about 5 years ago. But this is a reading for each day of the year, just kind of like when I was a child, our daily devotions after dinner, one for each day. This is what it says. I haven't even read it yet for January 23rd. January 23rd, Civilizing Mother. In 1901, the day after Queen Victoria breathed her last, a solemn funeral ceremony began in London. Organizing it was no easy task. A grand farewell was due the Queen, who gave her name to an epoch and set the standard for female abnegation by wearing black for 40 years in memory of her dead husband. Victoria, symbol of the British Empire, lady and mistress of the 19th century, imposed opium on China and virtue on her own country. In the seat of her empire, works that taught good manners were required reading. Lady Gow's Book of Etiquette, published in 1863, established some of the social commandments of the times. One must avoid, for example, the intolerable proximity of male and female authors on library shelves. Books could only stand together if the authors were married, such as in the case of Robert Browning and Elizabeth Barrett Browning. There happen to be a few books by both of those authors in Bob Datilio's collection behind me, and maybe we should go and put them next to each other just for the sake of Queen Victoria. So that's the end of the churchy stuff, and I want to sing a song as an introduction to our marvelous program. First, I'll take a sip of coffee from this wonderful mug that we got from our trip, Middle Fork River Expeditions, Salmon River. I wish you could all take this trip. And another reason that we decided to take this trip was that we heard a certain Daryl Scott, who's supposed to join us today, who is going to join a certain Greg Brown, both remarkable songwriters and performers and guitar players, on this trip. And we heard this from Daryl on a program he was doing with Susan Werner, another heroine of mine. And he mentioned this trip, and we looked at each other and we said, let's go on that trip. It's right around when you're retiring, and that became our retirement celebration for Jennifer, and we'll never regret it. This song is something that I wrote on the topic. I happen to have written it about 30 years ago, and it was based on some articles I read and on some traveling that I had done in the Northwest, in Washington and in Oregon. I had never been to Idaho before, though, and this summer I took care of that and took it off my checklist. This song is called Salmon River. Cry a song, shed a tear for a northwest salmon, sockeye streak of muscle, brawn and steel-headed whale, swimming salt water, fresh water, feast or famine. Their battle is uphill. Cast an eye of wonder at a river fast and long. It is a highway, it is a maiden voyage, a swan song. Feel a force that among the rushing ripples flow, as the fish on a survival death journey go. Salmon River winds its way through Idaho, and it sparkles as it runs, glistens as it goes. Many rapids bubbling down cry a last farewell. Where the sockeye will go now, no tongue can tell. There is a sad song in the crystal waters flow. Where have my salmon gone? The river wants to know. In spring came salmon, gave the river its name, shimmering salmon. One day no more came. say a prayer with the Indian, came here to offer thanks for this bounty, this feast, filled the river bank to bank, for this life-giving dance of 10,000 years cut short by the plans of a corps of engineers. Cry your many angry words at an arrogant race. Gotta grab all the land, all the water, all the space. Gotta make, gotta take, gotta get, gotta plunder, gotta dam it up, gotta chop it up, gotta plow it all under. Swim upstream 1,000 miles where you spawn and helpless lie, with the new ones being born around the old ones spent will die, in a never-ending circle of a life-giving dance. Stand with me before this miracle, does the sockeye stand a chance? For the salmon is a journey, it is a first and a last journey. Down the Salmon River to the Snake, to the Columbia River, to the cold, dark Pacific, this teeming life delivers. If not swallowed in the web of a toxic grip, they will be following that scent on a never-ending trip. If not taken in the drift nets, factory ships, through the krill-laden Arctic sea waters they'll slip. If not slaughtered for the worth of the bright orange roe, back to the waters of their birth, salmon doggedly go. Back to the dams, the electric rate payers built, to the cascade clear-cut river turned to silt, against a current of water, against a current of time, against a gotta get yours, gotta go get mine, against a plenty of blame to go around, against a river been so tamed that you cannot hear the sound of the salmon journey. Is it the last journey? Salmon River winds its way through Idaho, and it sparkles as it runs, glistens as it goes. Many rapids bubbling down cry a last farewell. Where the sockeye will go now, no tongue can tell. There is a sad sound in the crystal waters flow. Where have my salmon gone? The river wants to know. In spring came salmon, gave the river its name, shimmering salmon. One day no more came. Thank you. Well, that's my introduction to Mark Martin, who's one of the amazing young guides who took us down that river. It was just marvelous the way these folks took care of us, and just marvelous also that it wasn't just a routine thing. There were many moving parts to the thing. There was historic low water in the river, and there were fires that changed the plans and caused us to have to come out at a different place than we were planning on coming out. Nevertheless, it was just a remarkable trip, and I'm so glad to see a few of the people who were on it joining us, like Macy and Charlie, like a few others here. I can't go through them all, but Jennifer, of course, is joining us, and a whole bunch of people from different places on phone. So welcome to everybody, and I just want to thank Mark Martin for repeating a talk that he gave to us on the banks of the river. It's not quite as romantic and dramatic and breathtakingly gorgeous to be on a Zoom than to be next to that river in the middle of one of the most remote places in the whole country. But it's a pretty nice consolation, I'll say. And with that, I will thank you again for joining us and hand it over to you, Mark. I want to also one last thing tell you about another talk that Mark gave that was at the foot of a hill that had a bunch of paintings, or maybe it was just Native American graffiti, but it was all these paintings or etchings carved on wood of the what was it called, the sheep eater what tribe?
Shoshone relative.
Sheep eater, yeah. Shoshone. And that was another key moment. Thanks, Mark. Take it away.
All right. Well, thanks, Dean, and thanks everybody for tuning in. I've seen some names joining from, actually, oh yeah, there's Susanna. Hey, Susanna. I've seen some names joining from other river trips, some friends from around Idaho and whatnot. And that's a really good feeling to see folks that weren't even present for the trip that Dean's talking about, which was pretty all time. I think I can speak for the whole guide crew, but certainly for myself. And what a historic talk. I'd given this talk about 10 times throughout the course of the summer on different trips. And then Dean had asked me if it'd be okay if he'd sing his song when I concluded, my talk on our trip, and had no idea what that song would be, but it turned out to be the absolute gem that we just heard. And it was kind of an amazing way to cap off the talk and just emphasize everything I was talking about. This time, with Dean singing it beforehand, we have the added bonus of basically all of you just got like a bit of a natural history lesson, and a lot of the factual stuff that I'll be talking about. Anyway, to kind of start to get to it, I'm going to be kind of reading from my notebook a little bit here, so I don't have it all memorized. It's been a few months, but in any case, it's a talk about fish, about sea-run fish. Salmon could be the shorthand for that. Wild rivers, dams, damming them up here in the Northwest, the ecosystems that they're vital to. And it's kind of a talk about us and sort of connections and reconnections, our connection to our living planet. And, at the end, we'll kind of talk about this massive opportunity that we have to reconnect in more ways than one, not just the metaphorical, to some living processes that have been here for tens of thousands of years, that are basically on the edge of imminent collapse right now. So like just a tiny bit about me, my background. I grew up in Maine, as Dean mentioned, kind of a lifelong fly fisherman and, interested in fish and aquatic ecosystems and whatnot. I sort of watched the collapse of Atlantic salmon in Maine when I was a kid. Much like what we have here, Atlantic salmon entered the rivers in Maine and actually the whole Northeast. Basically around the time of colonization, they lived from the Potomac, right, DC area, all the way north to the Arctic Circle. And their last little vestige in the United States are the rivers in Maine. And when I was a kid, it was still a thing you could do, is go fly fish for Atlantic salmon. Throughout like my teenage years, they went on this decline that saw them, almost disappear in the night, right? Like down to a few hundred fish. for the whole state, not just one river system. So I worked in Atlantic salmon conservation for about 7 years, and then I moved to Idaho, start river guiding. I wanted to be a fly fishing guide. Those things all happened, and along the way, part of the reason I moved here was because there were still abundant fish runs of wild sea run fish to fly fish for, and I found myself doing that soon after I arrived here. Even the town I live in now, which is called McCall, I'm a little under an hour from, driving down the hill to the Salmon River, not far from where we ended our river trip, to be able to fish for, Chinook salmon, sea run steelhead, were there many left. So that's what kind of brought me here. And over the years of river guiding, I've begun to focus mainly on the middle fork of the salmon, which is one fork. It comes in above where Dean and Jennifer and Macy and Charlie and all of us did our trip. But the Maine salmon is also kind of my domain. And we have this unique situation here where tributaries to the Salmon River, like the middle fork, like the south fork of the salmon, a lot of them are very, very intact. And I should mention that adjacent to and surrounding a lot of these rivers is the largest roadless wilderness in the lower 48 states. It's called the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness. And I can't remember the number of millions of acres off the top of my head, but it is larger than Rhode Island by a good bit. That means an area with no roads, no development, larger than one of our U.S. states, and that is basically the bastion of habitat for the fish that we're talking about, fish in question. So where I am here in Idaho, and I'm talking about rivers and fish from an Idaho perspective. You could also add in northeastern Oregon to that, southeastern Washington. A lot of us are facing the same issues. Some of our fish come over the same dams and that sort of thing. But in central Idaho here, I'm mainly in the rivershed of the Salmon River. And the Salmon River drains an area that is larger in size than the wilderness area that I just mentioned. It's so larger by quite a bit than Rhode Island. It's probably the size of most of Connecticut, if not all, right? Just to put some things in perspective for New Englanders. So it's just enormous. The salmon, as Dean sung about, runs into the Snake River and meets up with that right on the Oregon border. And the Snake River then runs through Washington. It is dammed up 4 times along that stretch between Idaho and Washington. And then sort of like south central Washington, the Snake meets up with the Columbia River. The Columbia goes through 4 more dams and finally reaches the ocean, the Pacific, in Astoria, Oregon, basically between Washington and Oregon. It forms the border there. The fish that we're talking about are what we call anadromous, meaning they are born in freshwater. They spawn in freshwater. They spend a couple years there in the river, eating bugs, hiding in gravel, eluding predators, enduring massive temperature changes from, the warmth of summer, where in this part of the world, an average day temperature is around 80, 85 degrees, and, the water temperature fluctuates accordingly, to temperatures that, as you can see behind me, we're basically in the grip of winter right here. It's like 9:30 a.m. and it's still like freezing fog inversion, right? So there are all these environmental challenges that they face while they're in the river for a couple of years. And then sometime in their second, maybe third year of life, they begin to undergo these physiological changes, and something compels them to rise up from the bottom of the river out of the gravel that they've been sheltering in and foraging in for years. And as the high water comes up in the spring, when all this snow here melts, flows into the rivers are swollen, larger, faster. Those juvenile fish rise up into the water column, and the high water of the spring then washes them all the way down to the Pacific. And historically, that was a journey that would take them under a week to go from the roof of Idaho, which is, they'd be spawned at something around 7,500 feet of elevation, if not higher, and as far as 900 miles away from the Pacific. And they used to be able to make that journey in about a week when all the rivers were free flowing. And now it can take them over a month, which is obviously problematic. So upon reaching the Pacific, then they're going to spend anywhere between 1 and 4 years there. And the bell curve is centered right around, 2. And basically grow a lot larger, right? Turn into these like 5 to 40 pound fish. Like just add a ton of marine derived nutrients to their bodies while they're out there for a couple of years hunting and foraging. They turn around at some point, they swim back, and they enter the Columbia River. They find the smell of that river. They swim up it to the Snake. They swim up the Snake to the salmon. And from there, they will find to within a shockingly small distance, not only the same tributary of the river that they were born in, that they were spawned in, but sometimes the same pool, sometimes the same little stretch of gravel, like within a few yards of where they were born, and repeat that cycle all over again. They spawn, they die, their carcasses are left there, which sort of refertilize the river, feed uncountable different species, including the aquatic invertebrates that their young then feed upon after they're hatched, right? So it's this amazing sacramental circle of life, essentially, that is the refertilization mechanism for the high mountain and high desert ecosystems in this area. So we have historically we had 4 different sea-run species to this area of Idaho. And probably the marquee one that gets most of the attention, at least in this area, was Chinook salmon, or king. And before the dams that we'll be talking about were built in the 1950s, let's say, around 1.5 million Chinook salmon returned to Idaho. And that's anywhere between like 450 miles from the ocean to 900 at the very apex of that migration. And I don't have a map, Mary. Technologically, I just don't know how to include that stuff, and I don't have a paper one, but we can figure that out afterwards. I can send you a link to websites that I know have really nice, simple schematic maps of this area and exactly what I'm talking about. Anyway, so in the 1950s, about 1.5 million Chinook salmon returned to Idaho. Today, we get about 20,000 if we're lucky, 20,000 wild fish. There are sea-run steelhead, which are a sea-run rainbow trout, a little bit different than the other species of Pacific salmon in that they don't die after they spawn necessarily. They can spawn numerous times. The average from 1954 to 59, which is pre-Snake River dams, post-Columbia River dams, from what I was able to find, they averaged around 184,000 to Idaho. A little bit different life history with that species. And that was all wild fish. There were no hatchery fish. Now, around 40,000 had returned this year. That includes hatchery and wild. So a ton of supplemented reproduction from hatchery systems, which we'll talk about a little bit later. It's not exactly ecologically legitimate. We used to have coho salmon coming to Idaho. I couldn't find numbers on coho salmon, but they're extinct. The Snake River coho have been extinct for decades now. There's been a bit of a reintroduction program through a hatchery program on the lower Clearwater River, but that's kind of neither here nor there. And then sockeye salmon, which are the ones that Dean Song is about. And they're the ones, the ones that like turn red when they go to spawn, and green heads. And you always see photos of like bears catching them in Alaska and stuff like that. They're sockeye. So around 3,000 returned to the upper salmon when they started counting in the 1950s. That was significantly depressed due to construction of a couple upper system dams that have since been demolished. And then also the construction of the dams on the Columbia River had happened before these numbers were taken. So it was likely quite a bit higher, could have been in the hundreds of thousands to Idaho. And now literally a handful. Like this year, there is projected to be a run of about a couple hundred fish, which is already on life support. And due to extremely warm temperatures in the Columbia and the Snake, a couple dozen sockeye at most made it to the last dam in the system, whereupon they were loaded into trucks in water tanks that were cooled and oxygenated and driven like, I don't know, 500 or 600 miles to hatcheries in Idaho to keep them alive. So all of these numbers, those historical numbers that I'm talking about, are depressed from what they were pre colonization and pre-development of the inland and Pacific Northwest. Matt, thank you for replying to that while I'm charging ahead here. So those numbers sound tremendously abundant, especially hearing like 1.5 million Chinook salmon, right? Like there are a limited amount of river miles in the system, and that seems like a relatively unlimited number of fish. But that's actually significantly diminished from what would have been there even 100 years earlier, which is diminished from what would have been there 300 years earlier, right? What has caused this decline, I guess, is the next thing to talk about. And in cold water fisheries conservation and sea run conservation, we talk about the 4 H's that are ordinarily the cause of population declines. They are hatcheries, habitat, harvest, and hydropower. So just to very briefly explain each of those, hatcheries, there's a pretty widespread prevalent myth that supplementing runs of fish with hatchery fish is a means toward recovery of that population, and it is just that is a myth. There's really solid scientific evidence for like the last 40 years. We've known it for a long time that hatchery raised steelhead and salmon not only don't perform as well in the wild as wild steelhead and salmon, but through a variety of interactions, including breeding, can actually have a significant negative effect on wild returning salmon and steelhead, meaning those that were spawned in the river, spent their whole lives there, went to the ocean, came back, rather than being born in a building, fed pellets, all that kind of thing. I can go into that a little bit more later, but to continue on to the other H's, habitat. So habitat degradation due to logging, mining, development, agriculture, right? It has to do with essentially when they're in freshwater, it's spawning and rearing habitat, like habitat to lay eggs in, habitat for those eggs to hatch into young fish, and for those young fish to successfully forage, evade predators, and grow up to the size where they can then go to the ocean. And that can happen due to siltation, pollution, physical changes to the stream bed. A lot of gold mining did that in the late 1800s, early 1900s, would dredge out massive sections of stream bed and make them unrecognizable. Obviously, so agriculture can contribute to siltation and also thermal pollution, basically just warming of the rivers. So that's the habitat component. Harvest, obviously, commercial fisheries have been exploiting our ocean-going fish for years and years. There's a lot of us on the planet. There's a huge demand for seafood, for fish, right? And Northwest salmon have historically seen a lot of attention in commercial fisheries. That one has been largely curtailed in the Northwest. really robust fisheries still exist in like British Columbia and Alaska, but it's a minimal source of mortality for our Northwest fish anymore. And the last one was hydropower, and that's dams. And so hydropower has been thought of as this source of green energy, right? This sort of like it's sort of like a no cost solution, right, to our energy problems as a source of renewable energy, right? The river's always running, and there are no like like toxic effluents given off, right, by those reservoirs, by those dams. They don't emit, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide to the atmosphere. And so they've been kind of hailed as this green energy solution for, coming centuries. And I would, of course, argue that how green can we consider them if they're, obviously a major factor in the decline of very important keystone species like salmon and steelhead in places like the Northwest. There's also some research lately showing that larger reservoirs have large capacity to give off a ton of methane, right? Which is a little bit less of a greenhouse gas, gets a little less attention, but has a large effect. And so hatcheries, harvest, hydropower, habitat, those are the things that generally contribute to the decline of sea-run fish populations, and those are what have contributed to the decline here. Though I will say that at this point, I mentioned earlier, we're talking about rivers with very, very pristine habitat. These rivers also don't receive any hatchery supplementation. So the Middle Fork, in particular of the salmon, has never had a hatchery stocking program. Thank goodness. It's probably what's allowed its fish to survive. So habitat is there, the lack of hatchery is there. There's not really much of a commercial fishery for them anymore, and yet they're all still in decline. That really only leaves the hydropower option. And so we know pretty conclusively that the dams in the Snake and Columbia system downstream from here are what is causing the decline of our salmon and steelhead in Idaho. I focus on the 4 dams on the Snake River, and there's a reason why I do that. There are many reasons, actually. One, they are the most deadly to fish. Number 2, they're basically useless at this point. They don't pay for themselves. Number 3, they're becoming outdated, just sort of construction-wise from an engineering standpoint. They'll need a lot of really expensive equipment upgrades in the coming couple of decades. But also, it's the main thing is data gathered by the entity that owns these dams, which is the Bonneville Power Administration. I'll explain in a moment. Their own data have shown that these dams are a significant source of mortality to sea-run fish. And so the Bonneville Power Administration constructed the 4 Snake River dams in the 1960s and 1970s. And it was sort of this era of a boom in dam building. And there's since been, pretty open admission that during that time, the mid 20th century, the BPA, oh, nice, look at that. Yeah, that's where we are. All right. So that's the salmon marked in purple. Hit the Snake at the Oregon border, Snake to the Columbia, Columbia to the ocean. Thank you, Charlie, for doing that. Okay, so Bonneville Power Administration, Army Corps of Engineers, Bureau of Reclamation. Those two, the Army Corps and the Bureau of Rec, were basically in open competition to see who could build the most hydropower projects in the United States at that time. It's not a secret. it was basically this massive wave of hubris, this sort of like leftover manifest destiny, post World War II, just orgy of construction engineering. So the dams were constructed for hydropower, and also with the dubious purpose of trying to make Lewiston, Idaho, the world's furthest inland seaport. And they did that. Congratulations, hooray! It's right there. You can see it on the map. It's like one whole state inland from the ocean. But yeah, there are locks on each of those dams where container ships can be brought inland. It's mainly barges, but so it's Lower Granite, Little Goose, Ice Harbor, Lower Monumental. The Bonneville Power Administration that owns and operates these dams is a sort of a weird federal entity. They can operate like a private entity, but they are a federal entity. They are under government control, and major changes, such as essentially removing dams, would take acts of Congress and a ton of legislative support to get passed to actually move forward. So they're this weird agency that they don't really operate under the same rules as private hydropower companies, but they also it requires like a ton of effort to change anything with the BPA. Super entrenched, obvious good old boy network, and they're the ones that have been operating these dams since their construction. So at these 4 dams, counterintuitively, the problem with them is not so much the salmon migrating back upstream to their spawning grounds. The enormous bottleneck in population and the main challenge is faced by the young salmon migrating out to the ocean. And these 4 dams kill around an average of 10% of those out migrating fish at each dam. And there's probably some delayed mortality from that last dam, or maybe from all of them, that's measured at dams downstream. So it could be more like a combined 50%. That's just impossible to measure and tease out, but there's at least a 40% mortality rate from these 4 dams to the out-migrating juvenile fish, which are known as smolt. So currently, in order to rebuild our salmon steelhead populations, we would need around a 4% recruitment rate. And recruitment rate refers to basically the percentage of fish that leave their natal river to go to the ocean, that then make it all the way back to spawn. So out of 100 fish that leave, let's say, the middle fork of the salmon, go to the ocean, swim around, do their thing, eat a bunch of stuff, get big, come back, 4 out of those 100, if they return to successfully spawn, the population grows pretty strongly. 3 out of 100, it grows. Around 2, it stabilizes. 2 fish out of 100. That's enough to stop the decline. And currently, we're experiencing between 1 and 2% recruitment for our salmon from Idaho at this point. So I'm going to talk about a couple things about some of the things that actually kill the fish at the dams. So dam conditions are a big thing. So the river runs through these turbines that are massive, massive propellers, generating static electricity that then flows onto the grid. Those turbines are obviously a source of mortality, right? They're huge. They're spinning at high rates of speed, and a fish that happens to be sucked into the turbines doesn't have a great chance of survival. There are pressure gradients associated with the mechanisms of dams, right? From like very high pressure moving through the dam to much lower pressure at the bottom of the dam. And it'd be, it's kind of like, every space sci-fi program of like stepping out of the airlock into space unprotected, right? Something like that. There are introduced predators in the reservoirs above the dams, non-native fish species that were introduced for sport fishing that prey upon the juvenile fish on their way out. The slack water of the reservoirs itself prevents fish from being able to navigate the river quite as efficiently. So they were, as I mentioned, historically, the smolt would just ride this wave of high water from their mountain home to the ocean, right? And now they get to each reservoir and there's this 20-mile long section of river that's not moving. And they're really actually not equipped to be able to navigate that and to figure out where to go on their own. So that leads to a lot of just like swimming around in circles, and sort of like being susceptible to those introduced predators that I talked about, as well as native ones, right? But it's just an enhanced susceptibility due to the non-navigability of the slack water for them. The other thing that the slack water reservoirs does is it collects a hell of a lot more solar radiation than flowing water would, right? It's just sitting there heating up in the sun. Smolt are surface swimmers, and so they're a lot more susceptible to the hot water temperatures than they would be. Then, of course, there's basically just the slowdown of each reservoir. There are 8 reservoirs on the way out. And so these smolt have to go from being a freshwater fish with their osmoregulatory systems, handling just freshwater, to at the bottom of this journey, they're going to become a saltwater fish. And that's a pretty taxing process, that physiological change going from fresh to salt. So its timing is very finicky and very delicate. And it's not so good for the smolt to be delayed that much in their outward journey, right? And that's what those 8 reservoirs do, is they just slow them down. By the time they're getting to salt water, they've been spending like probably some weeks in freshwater with their bodies physiologically more aligned for saltwater, and that's tremendously stressing upon their systems. Those are some of the mechanisms by which the dams actually cause mortality. You may have noticed at this point I've mentioned 4 Columbia River dams as well. I'm focusing on those 4 Snake River dams, but there are 4 others on the Columbia. If you're wondering what about those, well, yes. What about those? They do kill fish as well. Basically, no dam is really good for a sea run of fish. But the 4 Columbia dams are a bit less deadly. They kill fewer. They're better constructed. They actually supply a lot more power than the Snake River dams do. So that means they're basically just a little harder to remove, right? That would be a little bit more of an uphill battle, actually a lot more of an uphill battle. And the numbers really don't lie, and the numbers show us that the salmon from rivers, if you see like where the Snake and the Columbia come together, and then the Columbia goes down to the Washington border, kind of from there on down past Portland to the ocean, there are a number of different rivers that enter the Columbia down there. The fish from those rivers don't obviously have to navigate the 4 Snake River dams. They only have 0 to 4 Columbia River dams to navigate on their way out and on their way back. The numbers don't lie. Those fish are doing significantly better than the fish that have 4 Snake River dams to navigate on their way out and on their way back. So we can put those Columbia dams to rest for now and focus our attention on the 4 Snake River dams. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about those. They were constructed, obviously, not just in a bit of an hubristic orgy, but also to provide some economic benefits to the region, to the inland Northwest. And so I'm going to tell you about their main benefits. Each of those, though, has a super valid counterpoint that I'll talk about as well. So their main purpose was to provide electricity for the region. But they contribute between 2 and 4% of the Bonneville Power Administration's Northwest electric grid. That's not very much, right? The grid is huge. It's a lot of Idaho, Oregon, Washington. I can't remember if Western Montana is on it or not, but anyway, it's a huge grid. Those dams provide very little of its power. And I wrote really small here. I don't know why, but that grid normally has a surplus on it at this point. When those dams were constructed, the future demand for electricity was greatly overestimated. And we've found here in the 21st century that the grid more often than not has a surplus of electricity and enough to sell to other grids. And mainly what the Bonneville Power Administration does is sell that surplus to California at below market rates. So they sell that at a loss. So yeah, and for those of you in New England, California is a little bit of a dirty word to Idahoans, even maybe the rest of the Northwest. I'm sorry, Matt. It's true. I don't necessarily feel that way, but I can't believe that more people aren't like outraged that like our power gets sold to California for less than market rates. I would hope that would be a little bit of a rallying cry for people that might be on the fence in this area, but it doesn't seem to be. I don't get it. So anyway, so a major fear of taking out these dams would be rate increases, right? Folks are concerned that if these dams are gone, their rates will go up. I'm a Idaho Power customer myself. A lot of their power is bought from BPA. Probably not from these 4 dams, but I'm on that grid. The thing is, though, that 30% of revenue from ratepayers goes to wildlife and fisheries restoration, and the vast majority of that goes to salmon and steelhead restoration. So 30%, as opposed to like 3 or 4% of the input to the grid, the math just doesn't add up there, right? So the dams are also constructed to provide the benefit of barging goods inland and barging goods to the ocean, right? To ports in like Vancouver and Portland and whatnot. So there is this barging industry that takes these huge chains of barges loaded with different things from Lewiston, Idaho to the ocean and to Portland to Vancouver, and then barges other things back upriver to Lewiston. Their main downriver product is wheat at this point. But basically, there has been an 80% reduction from peak of barging traffic in the 20th century. That industry is also heavily taxpayer subsidized. And there is already a rail line in place along the north bank of the Columbia to Portland/Vancouver. Most of that wheat traffic comes from a total of 17 wheat farmers. That is 17 white dudes that are keeping that barging industry alive. Well, that and everybody listening here who pays taxes, plus, a couple 100 million more people paying taxes. It's not exactly a thriving industry. It's not exactly economically viable if it was just left to the invisible hand of the free market. And it's eminently replaceable by upgrades to the rail system that's already in place along the north bank of the Snake and the Columbia. That's already there. All we have to do is upgrade it. Another benefit these dams and reservoirs provided was irrigation. So those 17 wheat farmers and a few other farmers in the region pump water from the reservoir up onto the top of the canyon to the plateau up there where they have their farms. So that is a benefit that's provided. However, were those dams to come out, let's say when those dams come out, there will still be a river of like 50,000 CFS running at the bottom of the canyon all year long. It's fed by, most of the state of Idaho. There's a ton of water in there, and there's still going to be a ton of water for them to pump up onto their crops and to allow for safe passage of fish, and basically ecological restoration of that flowing river. What would need to happen is their pipes would have to get extended a little further down the hill, right, to new level of the river, and then pumps upgraded a few more horsepower, right, to get the water up there. But it's not like if the reservoirs go away, all the water goes away. There's still a river down there. There's just not these big pools. So also dams were supposed to provide recreational opportunities for the inland Northwest. They've done that as well, right? Power boating, and some lake fishing for some of those introduced species. But it could really be argued that a free-flowing Snake River could support just as much recreational opportunity. It would support fisheries for restored salmon and steelhead runs. It would support river sports that aren't available there now. And anybody that's been on the river with us, can attest to like the magic of that trip, right? To ride on a free-flowing river a certain ways. There are something around 40 class 4 sized rapids, which is pretty big on that Snake River section between Lewiston and the Columbia. And as I mentioned earlier, like 50,000 CFS, that's quite a bit larger than the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon, which is known for having some of the continent's premier and largest whitewater. So if you've got 40 class 4 rapids in that 50,000 CFS section, let me just tell you, that's rowdy. That's big. And people will go do that if those rapids reemerge from the depths. I will be one of those people. And so there are towns all up and down the Snake, the Salmon, the Clearwater, the Grand Ronde in Oregon, and all the rivers that feed those. Obviously that stand to benefit greatly from increased sport fishing recreation that would vastly replace the recreation that's happening on those reservoirs right now. So that's kind of the benefits that those dams provide and the counterpoint to each. Now, in the face of all this, the Bonneville Power Administration, who owns and operates the dams, is in debt to the federal government. They've been operating as a loss as an agency for a couple decades now. I think it's like 20 million in debt or something like that, which isn't huge in the face of things. But I know that they will have to replace turbines at all 4 of the Snake River dams within the next 2 decades. That project will run into the tens of billions, and it doesn't seem like they have the money for that. They're already in the hole. And to date, since the construction of the last dams on the Snake, the BPA has spent $1.5 billion in ratepayer and taxpayer revenue on salmon and steelhead recovery in the rivers that were affected by the Snake River Dam's construction. So the Clearwater, the Salmon, and their systems. And they have failed to recover a single population, right? And we're listed like a population's considered like a river, like the Middle Fork, like the Maine salmon, like the Clearwater. They have spent $1.5 billion of their ratepayer and taxpayer dollars in the last 45 years to recover salmon and steelhead. Not only have they not recovered a single population to a harvestable, self-sustaining level, they have not managed to reverse a single downward population trend, All right. Like recovery is like, it's ridiculous to talk about when their efforts have entirely failed to even stop a decline. They haven't even been able to slow declines. It's basically been a catastrophic and massive failure. And, you know, the trend lines have been analyzed the past couple of years. The Nez Perce tribe, bless their souls, have been sort of the most diligent in working on this stuff. A lot of the agencies have some associations with the BPA that prevent them from going full on into investing in progressive salmon recovery. But the trend lines that have been produced of populations in the last few years show pretty much imminent extinction unless this project is undertaken. The 4 lower Snake River dams are removed. The vast majority, just like with climate science, fisheries science, right? Like the vast majority of scientists who have studied this issue agree that removal of these 4 dams would be the last best chance to recover salmon and steelhead in the inland Northwest to Idaho. It would be one of the biggest environmental restoration projects in world history. It would have the potential to double the return rates to Idaho. Remember, we were talking about that we need at least a 2% return rate, recruitment rate to stabilize populations. So the rivers that are below the Snake on the Columbia, they have 3 to 4% recruitment rates. The John Day is one of the best ones to look at in Oregon. It has all wild fish, doesn't receive hatchery fish, and it has been the most stable run of sea run fish in the entire Columbia system for years. It comes off the Columbia, runs north to south from Oregon. Can we pause at 12:20? David Roth. Yes, let's do that. Tell me when 12:20 is. I can't see the clock on my phone, but anyway, the John Day River is a great example. Okay. So Dean, we could pause right now because I'm about to segue into the benefits of dam removal and recovery. Or we could do that for a few minutes. And then yes, at the very end, I could segue into Columbia Basin Initiative stuff.
That would be great. Mark, let me tell everybody that the reason we're going to pause is because we have a very special guest. His name is David Roth, and if you are at all familiar with folkdom in this country, you know David Roth, and it just so happens David was on several Salmon River trips as the musician and was happy to join us between 2 different UU services that David is playing for. And we're just so happy to have you here, David. Will you make yourself known, or did you have to leave? Oh, David, I don't see him anymore. No, he's here.
I'm here.
He's here. Hi, David.
Hey, can you hear me?
I can hear you, and it looks like, oh, I got you. There you are. Welcome, David, and thanks for being willing to join us.
Well, it's my pleasure, and Mark, I'm so honored to hear you speak so passionately and eloquently about this trip. I'm a city boy from Chicago from way back, but the last 5 years I've been able to lead a rafting trip 3 times down the Middle Fork and twice down the main stem of the Salmon, taking 20 plus people with me and 6 excellent guides. And it's just an incredibly beautiful part of the country, and there's much discussion about these dams, amongst the guides on these trips and the need to remove them. So I offered Dean the chance to play a song that I wrote the first year I was on the river. I know there's a lot of singers here, so if you're sharing your Zoom room with somebody, you want to take a look at them right now and say something like, I can't wait to hear you sing with David. This is really going to be awesome. The song was inspired by the river and inspired by my interviewing my 6 guides who, the first year I went, ranged in age from late 20s to early 70s. So just about every decade was represented. And I asked them what brought them to this beautiful line of work, they committed their lives to spend so beautifully. All right, I've yapped enough. Here's how the chorus goes. Nothing like a day on the river, nothing like it at all. Nothing like a day on the river, can you hear the river call? Now is my voice coming through okay over the guitar? Hey, sing with me. Nothing like a day on the river, nothing like it at all. Nothing like a day on the river, can you hear the river call? 8-lane highway, cell phones are ringing, living under the gun. Lists and errands, calls and appointments, so many things to get done. The TV is blaring, the grown-ups are crazy, I don't know what's true anymore. Deep inside I can feel a yearning, it's time to renew and restore. Here we go. Nothing like a day on the river, nothing like it at all. Nothing like a day on the river, can you hear the river call? Sense of place, incredible beauty, the rapids are singing their song. Majestic, moving, spiritual, powerful, wondrous, tender and strong. It's always familiar and full of surprises, the lifeblood of canyons and hills. Wisdom and freedom, oh this is where I come to slow down and be still. You know what comes next. Nothing like a day on the river, nothing like it at all. Nothing like a day on the river, can you hear the river call? Mini Wichoni, water is life. Mini Wichoni, water is life. Highway, no phones are ringing, only one thing to get done. Put one paddle in front of the other, measure the day by the sun. Nothing like a day on the river, nothing like it at all. Nothing like a day on the river, can you hear the river? Nothing like a day on the river, nothing like it at all. Nothing like a day on the river, can you hear the river call? Can you hear the river call? Can you hear the river call? Can you hear the river call?
Yeah, thanks, David.
My pleasure.
You're muted.
Thanks for all your good work.
I like your attribution to the sun.
Dean,
Thank you, David.
Oh, there you're good.
Thank you, David, for that wonderful embellishment and addition to this program. And thank you for taking out a little time between your 2 UU services. And we'll get you back soon, okay, for Community Church?
Yeah, it would be my pleasure. And Mark, I'd love to talk to you some more, so I'll get your email, okay?
Okay, sounds good. Yep.
All right. Blessings all.
Okay. Bye, David. What a treat to have David. And Mark, please resume. I'm sorry to have interrupted you like that, but David needed to get somewhere else.
Yeah, no, that was great. Actually, I needed to drink some water. So,
For all waters.
yeah, indeed. Yeah. So, David, thanks for that too. I love that. On our trips, we've been able to bring just this whole host of folk singers and musicians for the last several years. Started with John Smith, who's become like a great friend and sort of just a honorary teammate for us at, you know, at MIFRE at this point, to Daryl, to David. Bernice Lewis did a trip this last fall. Moores and McCumber, Eli West, Ben Winship. We have Jeffrey Foucault coming next fall in the Maine. And they've just been such a blessing. And at least half of them have written a song about the river trip, or about the salmon, or the Middle Fork. And Bernice and I started writing one that's not done, that's quite a bit more off color and less reverent than the rest. But there might be a little bit of a CD or EP in the works here. I think that'd be pretty fun to hear everybody's river songs. But in any case, I'm gonna resume. And where I left off, I had just finished ranting about how, you know, the 4 Snake River dams were built with all these benefits in mind. And while they did provide those benefits, and they still do to an extent, each one of those benefits is more marginal than expected. It's declining or can be replaced. And essentially, none of the benefits that they provide are truly economically vital to the inland Northwest anymore. And that's a reality that's slowly dawning on people, though I will say the Bonneville Power Administration and those with vested interest in keeping those dams in place and not incurring costs themselves are fighting that reality with disinformation tooth and nail about those dams. But anyway, there is a tremendous groundswell right now to remove the 4 lower Snake dams, and there has been for about 20 years, but it's gaining renewed attention at this point. And I've begun to believe that I will see those dams fall in my lifetime. So we're just gonna operate on the assumption that they're gonna come out for the next little part of this talk. And I'm going to talk about what we stand to gain from free-flowing Snake River, from revitalized salmon and steelhead runs in Idaho, and, you know, our neighbors in the Northwest. So first of all, I think the most important and enduring benefit would be an ecological one. There have been 137 different species of flora and fauna in Idaho that have been identified that directly depend on salmon for nourishment, for survival, for vital nutrients. These are nutrient poor ecosystems up here. You can't really see behind me anymore. The sun's starting to poke through the fog, but basically I'm in this lodgepole pine forest on sandy soil, right? It'd be a lot like the pine barrens of New Jersey, some of the blueberry barrens in Maine. Like, it's not a rainforest. Most of this state isn't covered in moss and dripping with ferns. It's dry, it's arid, it's rocky, it's high desert, most of it. It just happens to be mountainous. If it wasn't mountainous, it'd look a lot like Utah, right? And so the geology sort of prohibits it from being like a really nutrient-rich system, as well as just the climate of this area. You know, pretty dry in the summer, pretty hot and dry. So what I'm saying here is that these millions and millions of pounds of marine-derived nutrients in the form of salmon carcasses, those nutrients that weren't there before, the fish went to the ocean at like, well, bigger than that. Let's say they're like 8-10 inches long. They go to the ocean at that size. If they come back 30 pounds, that's about 30.75 pounds of marine-derived nutrients, right? Like nutrients that came from the ocean that then get to refertilize the forests. The salmon literally refertilize the river with millions of carcasses. There have been the same stable isotopes. The stable isotopes that are identifiable in salmon flesh have been identified and detected in tree rings, core samples of trees, up to 4 miles away from the river. And so when you think about, you start looking at a map, like of, let's say, the middle fork of the salmon and all of its tributaries. And a lot of the tributaries are large enough for salmon and steelhead to spawn in them. you can barely get from one tributary to the next in 4 miles. Like, and 8 miles, forget about it, right? Like sometimes they're several hundred yards from each other on the other side of, like, a really steep ridge, or a mile away, right? So the reach of the nutrients provided by these salmon carcasses has the potential to blanket the entire ecosystem. There's not really a spot that's like out of reach of where these nutrients can go, right? So we're talking about basically the single most important source of nutrients for the inland Northwest forest, right? And species like trout, bears, otters, eagles, sculpin, insects that feed on carcasses, trees, plants, this entire assemblage of species, and others that we maybe can't see or seem mundane or something like that, that are directly dependent upon this input. So let's say we recover salmon steelhead to this part of the world. There's a tremendous stabilization. One thing that's happening in this part of the world, and others too, more significantly, but it's certainly happening here, is in the last decades we've noticed a significant increase in wildfire activity, right? So more of Idaho is burning. California grabs the headlines because everybody lives where it burns there. But in Idaho, a ton of public land and wilderness has burned in the last like 30 years or so. And so that forest does regenerate, and it is the natural regeneration regime of that forest that's been in place for thousands of years. However, there is one input that's significantly lacking now in that regeneration, and it is exactly what I've just been talking about, the addition of millions of pounds of marine-derived nutrients from salmon carcasses. So these forests are burning, and sometimes they're burning to moonscape, right, where there's nothing organic left. Without these millions and millions of dead salmon and the input they provide, it's going to take the forest a lot longer to regenerate, if it does at all, to its historical extent. And so more climate resiliency, wildfire resiliency, is something that our landscapes stand to benefit from salmon recovery as well. I think that number two, like a very close number two in the list of potential benefits of salmon restoration, is indigenous tribes. For tens of thousands of years before any of our ancestors showed up here, the Nez Perce, Shoshone sheep eater, or Tukarika, Nez Perce called themselves Nimipu, and Shoshone and Bannock tribes made a significant amount of their living, or fed themselves in large part on the salmon runs that return to their rivers each year. They used to harvest up to half of the adult returning salmon could be harvested. The following year, the abundance would be the same. Remember, I was talking about 1.5 million Chinook salmon to Idaho in the 1950s. Let's call it 4 million in 1700, right? Then you could harvest 2 million Chinook salmon for a population of tens of thousands, and still have the exact same abundance when the progeny of that run came back in like 4 years. That's a definition of sustainability, and also given the sacramental nature of this cycle, it is the definition of connection, right? And sort of like this complete circle of a renewable, self-renewing food source that invites your participation in stewardship. And the tribes all talk about salmon. The one thing you notice is that they all refer to like salmon people, salmon nation, right? They refer to their to these species that they used to depend upon for food as just another nation of people, and I think that is incredibly valid. They were not only an ancestral food source, but like this incredible spiritual blessing, right? Is what it was seen as. Something we did in the late 1800s to subdue a lot of the more hostile tribes that, for some reason, who knows why, were not quite down with us steamrolling across the landscape and claiming their lands for our own and displacing them. There was a concerted campaign, especially in the Great Plains, to exterminate the bison, which was the main source of food for Plains tribes. And with their food source gone, they would be then a lot easier to subdue in warfare. That's not a secret anymore either. That was a very well documented policy. It was done on purpose. And I would argue that the continuing reversible decline of salmon steelhead in the inland Northwest and throughout the Northwest is simply modernized continuing violence against indigenous tribes. This was one of their best and most nutritious food sources, right? Like now sort of our modern diet scientists are telling us the same thing that they've known for thousands of years without having to spend any money on researching it, which is that salmon, in fish in general, but mostly salmon, especially Chinook salmon, are incredibly healthy, right? There's so much good fat in that fish, and it doesn't give you diabetes, right? It's just like it's the most healthy self-renewing food source in this part of the world. In our continuation to ignore that as a viable food source, to keep salmon runs depressed and on the rocks, I think is continuing violence against indigenous people. I bet a lot of people here would agree with me. And I think that even more so, I mean, there's of course, I'd say next in line, there's an economic benefit to recovering salmon and steelhead, and that is, a lot of the towns up and down the rivers receive visitors that come there to fish, right? And I've seen it myself in the town of Riggins, which is the one down the hill from me on the salmon. It's this tiny little hamlet. But when there are salmon in the river, when there are steelhead in the river, there are drift boats, there are people in motels, there are people, eating meals at restaurants, or people putting gas in their boats and trucks. It's the largest influx of money to the local economies of these little towns up and down the rivers. And so not only that, but then there's sort of like the personal connection. I am personally a fly fisherman who's fished for salmon and steelhead in Idaho for the last 14 years. It's very important to me. It's my favorite thing that I do, and it's my favorite way to participate in this weird little dance, with that crazy circle of life of salmon and steelhead, and the magic trick that is coercing that fish to take a fly that I crafted myself, that I tied myself, that I tied on, identify the water that they'll be in, and sort of like refine my techniques to presenting that fly to them. And then like the magic trick is, out of nowhere, this fish that grew up, up in the sawtooths at 7,500 feet, made its way to the Pacific, swam around for 2 years doing God knows what, and then made its way all the way back, will then bite my fly that's swimming along in front of it. It's a magic trick. It's incredible. There's no way that should work, right? It's the coolest thing. But that personal benefit and the economic benefits that I was just talking about, I think they massively pale in comparison. They're almost unmentionable in the face of the ecological benefits and the indigenous benefits of recovering salmon and steelhead. That's justice, right? For me, it's like about getting to recreate in the way that I enjoy recreating. But I think for tribes, and I think for ecosystems, it's justice, and it's reconnection, and it's wholeness. And that's like, we can barely talk about ourselves as fly fishermen in comparison to that stuff, right? Yes, that's how I came to care about it. That's how I came to become involved as a guide, as a fly fisherman. But the purpose is way larger at this point. And so, I guess just to summarize, recovery of these species in this area has the potential to provide this just sort of vital, renewable, spiritual, nutritional resource. And that resource, I think, is like the ultimate connection to this place. A good definition of the Pacific Northwest is wherever salmon swim. I am sitting on the edge of the Rocky Mountains here, and just down the hill from my house is where salmon should swim. I should have salmon in the creek that's 200 yards that way. They've been extirpated by dams. But I would argue that if we as a society who are not likely to go anywhere anytime soon, are to more consciously inhabit this continent that our ancestors, yes, forcibly took, then I think we need to rediscover or recover or even discover a sense of place that we've never really had. And I think that sense of place involves an embeddedness in the natural systems that surround us. And that could be true. That could be true in Boston. That could be true in Seattle, right? It could be true in Houston, right? It's just, it's a connection to your food sources. It's a connection to the ecosystems that surround you. And a sort of living within the boundaries of those in a sustainable and mindful way. And I propose that in the Pacific Northwest, we start right here. Like we start reestablishing that connection with our runs of salmon and steelhead. And that basically concludes like the background, the nuts and bolts of this talk. And now there's one more topic, and that involves action on the issue, right? We've covered like what's happening, why it's important, you know, why the fish are disappearing, how they're disappearing, just how amazing they are. And now it's time to talk about moving forward. And we had a major step taken a little under a year ago. There's Congressman Representative Mike Simpson from Eastern Idaho. He's a Republican, and he proposed what is called the Upper Columbia Basin Initiative. I want to talk a little. I'll mention how it came about. Mike Simpson was pro hydropower, sort of dyed in the wool, old school Republican from Eastern Idaho for years and years. One of our conservation nonprofits here in Idaho, and I'm not sure which, was able to convince Mike and his wife to accompany them to the headwaters of the Salmon River, or the headwaters of Middle Fork of the Salmon, which is my bread and butter. That's where I work all summer long. The headwaters of the Middle Fork are at around 7,000 feet at the very end of the Sawtooth Range outside of Stanley, Idaho. If you've never seen that place, you should probably look it up. You should probably find yourself there at some point in your life because it's incredible. So these are some of the highest up spawning salmon on this, continent, basically. Simpson and his wife were brought to these headwaters and shown wild native Chinook salmon spawning in their natural habitat, and just explained the amount of barriers that these fish had to overcome to get there. The dams, the trip through the ocean, the journey uphill for 700 miles back to that point. And here they are about to spawn and die, basically sacrifice their bodies for the continued renewal of their species. That struck a chord with Mr. Simpson, as I don't know how it couldn't, with anyone who has a soul, right? And so he's dedicated a ton of his legislative career at this point to working on this issue. He put forth the Upper Columbia Basin Initiative. He conducted over 300 stakeholder meetings with representatives from all the different industries and groups involved, from agriculture, Bonneville Power Administration, communities, conservation organizations, the energy industry, recreation groups, tribes, the transportation industry. And he basically asked the question, what if those dams came down? How would you be affected? Could the benefits those dams provide be replaced? Hint, they can. We talked about that already. And how much would that cost? for those benefits to be replaced for you. So in the end, his plan, it's just an initiative. It's not legislation or anything like that yet. It's just a start. It's an early framework. Estimate would be that it would cost a minimum of $33.5 billion for breaching the dams. Sediment mitigation, right? Because there's a ton of sediment in those reservoirs. It's going to have to go somewhere. The energy replacement from them, which most of it's already been replaced by wind and solar, but whatever. That's not looked at as legitimate by a lot of groups. But and then it would relicense other dams in the region for 35 years to allay people's fears about the slippery slope phenomenon, which is like, once we start taking out dams, we're going to try and take them all out. Well, you know what? I wouldn't be that sad. But some of them, they can remain in place, right? Like some are really useful for low cost energy. Some are not that economic or environmentally destructive. There are some dams we could leave in place, but anyway, like to allay people's fears about this, for 35 years, all other hydropower projects in the region of the BPA would be relicensed and allowed to continue. It would also put a 35-year, moratorium on litigation about those dams. So that, right, like, so it's just like one thing at a time, right? So unfortunately, Simpson's plan got a lot of pushback, a lot of criticism, very little support. Obviously, his Republican colleagues thought it was the coming of the Antichrist, but then disappointingly, a lot of folks across the aisle did not put a lot of support behind this initiative either. I will say it is kind of vague in some ways. Reading through it myself, there's some bullet points that are like, and other costs to be determined later, right? Which is like, that's not super confidence inspiring. Then again, this could be the most extensive environmental restoration project in our nation's history. There's going to be some stuff that we won't be able to foresee right off the bat with, 2 or 3 years of research and some stakeholder meetings. We're going to have to go a little deeper than that. It does stop short of drafting legislation, but I think the important thing is it got people thinking, talking, and working. It definitely got me off my ass and on this horse that I'm on now. And it also does just provide the spark for collaboration, rather than these relationships between conservation interested groups and industrial interested groups to be just completely antagonistic all of the time. I think this is an encouragement to find a collaborative solution. So following this in October, Washington Governor Jay Inslee and Senator Patty Murray announced their own plans to pursue a joint federal and state solution for Columbia Basin salmon recovery, including including a look at breaching the 4 lower Snake River dams, because they were not super satisfied with Simpson's proposed initiative. Their recommendations, what they come up with, will be completed by July 31st, 2022. So it's a little bit frustrating to have like one seem like totally fine plan put forth, and then for like a whole nother group of politicians to be like, no, we don't know about that. We're going to take another year to do the same thing, right? And come up with another similar plan. But it's at least movement on this issue, and it gives me a tremendous amount of hope. Yeah, there are a lot of reasons to have hope, and one is the resiliency of these fish themselves. They've been through so many different environmental catastrophes over tens of thousands of years, right? The disconnection and reconnection of some of their watersheds due to natural processes, some natural climate change, things like that. They've persisted this far. And basically, for them to continue to thrive into the future, all we have to do is open up the road. Just give them a clearer path to get to the ocean, to get back. And then we manage to sustain, to keep one of the most iconic and environmentally, ecologically important sets of species that occur in this region. That's basically my talk, you guys, and I'd love to open it up for questions. I do have I have some nonprofit groups, some organizations that you guys can follow along with, get on mailing lists. Excuse me. They're always up for donations. There's one really important one from the Idaho Conservation League that allows you to input where you live, and they'll help you draft a letter to your legislators, to your representatives, to your senators, to be sent in support of Columbia Basin Initiative or whatever other plan arises. And I'm super grateful to you all for having joined in today on your Sunday morning / Sunday afternoon. I'm grateful just to have some ears and eyes for this talk. Having mentioned that the Bonneville Power Administration, these 4 dams are essentially under legislative control. It takes a literal act of Congress to do anything with them. In other words, take them out. And that means that even though those dams are in Washington, they affect Oregon and Idaho. It would have to be a nationwide effort of conservationists and citizens. It has to be a nationwide legislative effort to have them removed. That's why you folks in Boston are relevant. That's why, like, my friends in Texas are relevant. Matt, you and Candy in California. Everybody, no matter where you are, like, this will become an issue that's coming to your doorstep, and an issue that will need you. And I am super thankful for the opportunity to bring it a little beyond my one river and my one region. So thank you guys. Appreciate it.
Yay. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Mark. Nice job. You can feel your passion, brother. Hey, you mentioned some links, or is that going to be a follow-up email that we get from Dean, or how will we see those links?
Good question. No idea, but Dean, how would that work?
Mark, before we go,
Yep.
if you could put the links in the chat, I will copy and paste the chat on the YouTube presentation that is available anytime for anybody to watch. And you should know that you can find that. Go to YouTube and put in Community Church of Boston Official, and you can find this and all of our other events there. So if you're able to put that in the chat, if not, I can just email it to me, and I will add that to the YouTube presentation a little later. Thank you so much.
I might do. I'll do it that way. And Matt, I think I have your email anyway, right?
You know what? I'll text it to you to be sure that you do. I texted you that the link for that Salmon River map. Thought you might like to have that. So I'll follow up with my email shortly here. Okay.
And I also, okay. So what I'll do is, Dean, I'll email you the link. And if you can distribute it to members of the church. And then what I'll do, there it is. Thanks, Matt. I'll then, you guys probably saw, like a month and a half ago now, I sent out an email to all of basically everybody whose email address I had from a river trip this summer. And I can do that again with this Idaho Conservation League link. I had tried it a few weeks ago after I found it, and I had some Gmail issues. Like some addresses were no longer valid, and it wouldn't let me send, and I couldn't figure out an easy solution. So, but I'll work on that again, because I think that's one of the coolest resources I've seen from a nonprofit on this issue, is that you can just go in, like, if I remember correctly, it's like input your zip code, and they're like, cool, Russ Fulcher is your representative, and here we'll send it to him. So I'll add in. Well, I think initial email had some of those nonprofits to follow and things like that. But anyway, I'll re-add those. But
sure. And I actually reached out to Representative Mike Simpson's office to see if there was somebody who wanted to come on and add something or other and explain to us what it is about his proposal that Washington governor and Maria Cantwell and what the other the stalwart Democrats in Oregon and Washington object to, and who knows, this could maybe turn into one of the very, very few bipartisan issues that they latch onto. Here's a Republican from Idaho with a plan that it looks like a good plan, and need to find out what it is that is keeping those Dems from latching on to his plan and giving it critical mass. Another thing, Mark, I wonder if you'd talk about is the incredible success supposedly that there's been in dam removal on the Olympic Peninsula, the Elwha River, as well as on the East Coast, the Edwards Dam in Maine. That it seems like those have really had some astonishing results and shown how resilient this fish is.
Yeah, I would love to. That's I've added that part that narrative, especially the Elwha narrative, into my talk numerous times throughout the summer on the river. And I wasn't sure how geographically relevant it would be, and if people would know. And just in the interest of time, I figured I'd maybe bring it in later. But I'm going to start with the dams in Maine that were removed. Edwards Dam on the Kennebec was an early 2000s dam removal. Before it was cool, you might say. Excuse me. The Kennebec River historically had runs of Atlantic salmon, herring, shad, striped bass, there tomcod, lamprey, eels, and all those species were really diminished by a series of dams on the Kennebec, and Edwards was the first one above the head of tide. A lot like the Snake River dams, it didn't control any flooding, and it couldn't control the level of its reservoir. And that's a bug of it's a feature of the Snake River dams too. They can't control their reservoir level at all to control how much power they produce at different times of the year, times of the day. And so Edwards Dam was taken out. I can't remember the year, but I was in Maine for that. And almost immediately you saw this rebound in a lot of the estuarine species, the striped bass, the tomcod, the herring, the shad, the eels, the lamprey. A similar thing has been done on the Penobscot River. If you've seen the film Damnation, I used to work on one of the dams that was featured there. That was the first one right above the head of tide. You could see down on the next corner of the river from the top of the dam, you could see when the tide would come up and fill up to there, and then these rapids and this current would be exposed when the tide went out. So that dam and another were removed on the Penobscot in order to try to bring back Atlantic salmon. All the other species that I mentioned with the Kennebec that returned to that river upon the removal of Edwards Dam also have returned to the Penobscot in large numbers, especially the shad, herring, and striped bass. Unfortunately, the Atlantic salmon has been a little bit harder to recover, but that has something to do with that hatchery myth that I talked about earlier. So in Maine, Atlantic salmon have been hatchery supplemented since the early 20th century when they began to decline there. And so there is almost not a genetically wild Atlantic salmon left on the Penobscot. Its parents were born in a hatchery or grandparents somewhere not far back, right? The majority of the reproduction has been hatchery. And that has actually prevented, it's been a super hindrance to the recovery of the wild salmon in Maine. And I think the last report I saw, that it would take a minimum absolute best case scenario of 65 years to recover Atlantic salmon to not fishable populations, but self-sustaining populations in Maine. And we are lucky that a lot of the rivers that we have out here have not received that hatchery supplementation. Now, the Elwha that I'm going to talk about now is one of those. So in the early 1900s, there were 2 dams built on the Elwha River, neither of which had fish passage. Couldn't get up, couldn't get down. There just wasn't happening. And they were hydroelectric dams. They were built illegally in violation of tribes' treaty rights. But they were built anyway. And they stood until 2012 or 2013. There were several species of salmon and sea run steelhead in the river prior to those dams' construction. After the dam's construction, you basically had some Chinook salmon barely hanging on below the first dam, and you had some winter run steelhead barely hanging on below that first dam. So the way it works in the Northwest, like the Chinook salmon spawn, they run in the spring and they run in the fall. And then the steelhead, the sea run rainbow trout, they run in the summer and they run in the winter. And so they use the freshets from each specific system of rain. Like the rain falls, it rises the river, they ascend, like as the river just starts to fall, they ascend and they access these spawning grounds that without that extra bit of water, they wouldn't be able to get into. So there was a life history of steelhead called summer steelhead in the Elwha prior to dam construction, that once those dams were put in, those summer steelhead ceased to exist. They went extinct. Winter steelhead still spawn in small numbers below the dams, but those summer steelhead were gone entirely. And so behind, up in the forest, in the mountains, behind the upper dam, there were rainbow trout, right? And remember, steelhead is a sea run rainbow trout. There are rainbow trout that persisted in the river up there, and they just lived out their lives as trout. They never left the river because they couldn't. And it was actually a secret, from what I've heard from people that were familiar with it back in the day. A bit of a secret, amazing trout fishery of all these rainbow trout that were up there and surviving and thriving. When those dams came down, all of a sudden the way was clear for trout to go to the ocean. Now, and with every salmon and some steelhead and some salmon populations, there's an associated resident component. Like some of them never go to the ocean, they just stay in the river for their whole lives. And that's basically a genetic insurance policy in case of, say, a blockage in the river, like a landslide. That actually happened in the middle fork of the salmon tens of thousands of years ago. Or now in our case, modern case, a dam. So what happened was those rainbow trout that were stuck behind the dams, when the final barrier was removed in like 2017, all of a sudden they had a clear road to the ocean and back, and the ones with the itch went. Those ones came back 2-3 years later as, big 10, 15 pound sea run steelhead. And 3 years after that last barrier was removed, a fellow that I know peripherally named John McMillan, who is a steelhead scientist on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington, was able to do a snorkel survey. He did that along with a guy named Shane Anderson, who's an amazing filmmaker in the Northwest, who's worked on salmon steelhead issues for just about his whole career. They documented in a very short stretch of river, like over 350 summer steelhead, extrapolated out to other sections of the river that they were not able to access because they weren't safe to snorkel in, basically. They estimated a population of around 1,000 summer steelhead in the Elwha. Long story short, they were essentially, they were extinct, right? They just had genetic remnants in the trout that lived in the upper river. But when the way was clear, those trout just became summer steelhead again. It was a life history that was entirely absent from that river that managed to return just because the way was clear. The reason that's relevant to our rivers here, especially the middle fork of the salmon, is because we see a lot of resident rainbow trout in the middle fork of the salmon. And I'm sure there are resident Chinook salmon as well that do the same thing and don't go. And I mentioned earlier that I have a lot of hope for, you know, the resiliency and recovery of these fish. This is one reason why. We have a pretty healthy and robust resident rainbow trout population in the middle fork. I see them when I'm snorkeling. We catch them when we're fly fishing. And they've been increasing in recent years too. And basically, once the way is clear for these fish to go to the ocean and come back, the same thing that happened with the Elwha has the potential to happen here. It has the potential to happen everywhere there is a dam that's outdated and unneeded. There's a massive dam removal project that is about to begin in 2024 on the Klamath River in Northern California, which is, I think, the fourth largest system in California or third. Maybe even the second. I don't know. It's massive. The Klamath is huge, and it extends up into the Southwest Oregon high desert or South Central Oregon high desert. It was one of the most important salmon rivers in the Northwest. They've been having a really rough time there. But 3 dams are slated to come down on the Klamath starting in 2024 that will open up hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles of spawning habitat that's been unavailable. That's going to be a success story. Like, we've not seen a dam removal yet that hasn't been some form of success story for that ecosystem. As in the case of those Maine dams that came down, some of the target species, the Atlantic salmon in particular, are having a tougher time. They have a few more human-imposed challenges that persist there. But in the Northwest and a lot of these rivers, we don't have those same challenges. Like, our fish haven't been on that hatchery life support for decades the way they have there. And yeah, some have been, it's been decades for some, like the Clearwater, the salmon has had hatchery supplementation since the 70s. But there are still huge wild components: the Selway, the Lochsaw, the Middle Fork, the South Salmon, North Fork salmon, East Fork salmon, like all these tributaries that have wild runs of fish that are going to be allowed to recover on their own, which is the best way to do it, honestly. So, you know, this is still a hard fight, but the future is kind of bright. Like that Klamath project, I'm pretty sure the Bonneville Power Administration is quaking in their loafers over that Klamath project because it's huge in scope. It's one of the largest removal projects in history. I don't know, man, but there's a lot of stuff to do in between now and then. You can't just go at it with bulldozers and dynamite. Or you can, but I don't want to spend the rest of my life in jail. But you know, we'll take what we can get, basically. But as these projects get larger and larger, and they start showing more and more success, that's going to put pressure on the administrators of, like, our system, you know, the lower snake. And basically show people that it can be done. It can be economically revitalizing. It can be ecologically revitalizing. And it can be just a massive, multifaceted reconnection to the rivers of the region for, you know, any region that undertakes a project like that.
Wow. So rich, Mark. It's just like an honor to be in the presence of somebody who really, really is so deeply passionate and so knowledgeable about this. Lynn Siegel, you have your hand up. Would you like to join us?
What I didn't really understand, Mark, is how does the salmon, when it's come to the end of its life and it's dead, how does it migrate into the ecosystem, like that 4 miles? Is it because the bear eats it and then poops and then it gets into the...
Exactly. You got it. Yep. It's let's say it's bears, it's eagles, it's anything else that scavenges, foxes, coyotes, excuse me,
Oops.
otters, and then anything that preys upon them, right? We have a ton of ospreys and eagles in this area. So it's basically that, right? It's like that relies on wildlife, sort of bringing those nutrients up into the system. But that's exactly what happens. Like we've all seen the videos of like the bears in Katmai National Park that like they wait on that little like 4-foot high waterfall for the salmon to jump. And there's millions of salmon and there's a whole crowd of bears. Like there's a pile of bears there just waiting because it's like the best food source for them for their upcoming winter, right? They need fat and sugar, right? Like berries and fruits, and then the fats that are provided by these salmon carcasses. And so if you had a million salmon carcasses lining the riverbanks, just think about like at all of those like wild/suburban interfaces where like people have all these problems with like bears in their trash cans. I've done some like bear work in Maine, and what I can tell you is that bears really like stuff that is as gross as possible. We would do some like snare trapping of bears for radio collaring purposes. And the way that you would get a bear accustomed to a trap site was through bait. And that was like, we would get herring and alewives from fishermen down east Maine. And we would put those out at those bait sites over and over and over. And the bears would just basically camp out there all summer and like chow on dead fish. It's like it's what they want in the fall, right? So basically once those carcasses are there, the mechanism is there for them to be distributed throughout that forest. And bears, I would say, they're probably one of the biggest distributors, right? Because they're large, they eat a lot, they poop a lot, and they're wide ranging, right? Like bears travel pretty far. Yeah, so that is basically how those nutrients migrate uphill in that system.
What about getting all the life out of them? Because once they're dead, they're dead anyway. But if you kill them before, then you're losing some energy.
Some spawning potential.
Yeah.
There's always been the potential for that, right? And so like those bears in the Katmai National Park video, like they're catching those fish before they spawn. But I think the thing is like if the abundance of fish is there, that sort of takes care of itself, right? Like when they're in the river and they're still able to spawn, when they have enough energy in them to spawn, they're actually like they're still pretty vibrant. We float over them at times. We spot them in the river. Well, I guess we're not technically allowed to float over them when they're spawning, but we view salmon in the river. And sometimes you see them outside of a spawning area. They're staging the spawn. And they're still like, you float near them with a raft and they're lightning fast, right? It's a 40-pound fish that's like 35 miles an hour. It's gone, right? So up until the point that they're actually spawning, they're still pretty nimble and they're able to evade those predators fairly easily. It's not until the post-spawn, ordinarily, given like normal conditions like high water temps and stuff can sort of torpedo their plans and cause them decreased fitness. But ordinarily, like through their spawning, they're still like really nimble. They're really vital. They can avoid those predators. Bears aren't that fast, actually, right? To like be able to catch a fish. Otters can do that. But like, there's not a massive like predation risk. There is some, but not enough to like prevent so much spawning of fish that it's a problem, right? It's not until after they spawn, their internal nutritional resources are depleted, that they become a lot slower, and a little more available to
How long
predators.
do they live after they spawn?
Can be a matter of days, can be a matter of weeks.
Really?
And it's, yep.
Not like people at all.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's pretty wild. Like sometimes you'll find a nest or a red, a big, like dining room table sized patch of cleaned off, scooped out gravel. And somewhere near that, you'll find the fish that spawn there. And they want their carcasses to be near it, so that they literally feed the aquatic invertebrates that then their young hatching out of that nest will try to feed on. It's like their own carcasses, right, that then fertilize and feed their progeny. And so they'll stay there, and the more time goes by, the more they degrade. Sometimes like their flesh is like falling off of them. You can see their eyes are blind. The bones of their faces and snouts are exposed. They look as much like a zombie as anything I've ever seen, but they're still spinning along in the current, just like,
Wow.
I gotta stay here. I gotta stay here. I gotta stay here. And then you'll find one in the shallows in 3 inches of water, and that's where it came to rest. And it looks like a dead fish, and it's gilling, right? And they just they just hang there and do the best they can to stay in that spot until until their last, basically.
What's their
pretty
lifespan?
crazy. Lifespan is usually 2 to 3 years in river, then 1 to 4 years in the ocean, and then that final several months in the river when they come back to spawn. So it's anywhere from 2 years to 7, 8 tops.
Yeah. Mark, we just got an email from John Smith who says, "Hello, Dean. Wisconsin songwriter John Smith here. So cool to see you are having Mark Martin talk about." Whoops, I just lost it. About the plight of the salmon and the dams. Tell him I say hello. I lead trips on the Middle Fork of the Salmon River in Idaho, and Mark is also a rafting guide. Hope you're well, amigo. John is somebody that we hosted for a house concert some 18 years ago when our kid was 6 years old. I remember it well. Yeah. Our kid loved his song that's called Part-Time Angels and sang the whole song with him at the age of 6. John Smith, I wanted him to get on, but he didn't get on. And we're getting to the near the end of this wonderful event. It's just I'm so hungry to learn, and I hope that's what our church is about. And we have quite a variety of different events, and this has been a very different one and a very enlightening one, and it just speaks to the miraculous magic of what is the Salmon River, and it speaks to the bigger thing, which is the miraculous magic, which is this planet Earth, and that we have to redouble our efforts, and that's an understatement, to save it and start with the wild salmon and end with the entire planet and the people and all the wild living things that are along with it. So again, thank you, Mark Martin. Charlie, can we unmute everybody to give one final applause to Mark for joining us here today? If you can't hear it, you can watch it in the little rectangles. Mark Martin, I'll get all of those links from you, and I will paste it onto the YouTube comment section.
Excellent.
And we'll send the YouTube link to Representative Mike Simpson and his staff, and hope that it will be useful for their work, because this is just such a full, enlightening 2 hours that we have had with you. Thank you again. Greetings to all the rest of the guides. And I don't know if it'll ever happen, but I hope that we'll be back on that river again. We made such wonderful friends. Some of who are with us today on the call, like Mason and Charlie, and like Susanna and Dan, and and like you. So again, thank you so much. I want to end with a little song, a little last verse of a song. I was going to do Bill Staines' River, the late Bill Staines, who just died. Beautiful song, River. But this is what I want to end with, which is, if I were the sun, making daytime bright, making day bright. Look down on the earth, spinning day and night, like a great big ball of blue and green, where the land and the sky and the sea come together, and the wind and the clouds swirl around making weather. It's the prettiest doggone planet I've ever seen, I've ever seen, I've ever seen, I've ever seen. Huh! Save some world for me, mister. Save some world for when we grow up. Save some world for me, mister. Save some world for when we grow up, 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 when we grow up. Huh! Thank you, Mark Martin.
Yeah.
And we'll say goodbye to everybody. Look on our website to help our efforts here. There's a credit card or a PayPal option for you to contribute. And look into our upcoming programs. We have a feast of wonderful stuff coming up in the next Sundays and Fridays and other days of the week as well. So goodbye, Mark, and we'll see you soon, okay? And goodbye, everybody. Have a great week. Good work. Bye, Richard. Bye, Macy, Charlie. Bye, Dorothy, Jackie Royce. Bye, Lindan, Barry Warner, Sue Simpson, Alan. A bunch of whole phone numbers that I won't call out their names. Meeting at the building is over. We do declare an adjournment of this meeting, of this sacred meeting. We'll talk.